Good morning, everybody. This is Sarah Frame, Senior Director at MassTLC. Welcome. Since 2015, MassTLC has been benchmarking the tech sector demographics in Massachusetts. We monitor our trends and compare ourselves to similar tech hubs across the US. In the 6 years we've been doing this, the needle has barely moved. We are now in an awakening, and we must take advantage of the spotlight that's being put on the lack of diversity, the lack of inclusivity, and the lack of equity, not just in tech, but in everything. At MassTLC, that can start with ourselves and our members, and it must start from the top as our core business imperative. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our series sponsor, Wayfair and Mimecast, and also Akamai and PTC for underwriting our entire social justice initiatives, including our Tech Compact for Social Justice. If you're not aware of the compact, you can learn more about it at our website. This morning, we'd like to engage you in the conversation, so please use your chat and question functions to communicate with us. I'll be monitoring that throughout the entire time. Today, we'll hear from companies whose leaders are ensuring that they do their best to foster a safe and welcoming place for their employees, their partners, and their customers. I'll now turn it over to Janet Wu from Bloomberg.
Sarah, thank you so much. It is a real pleasure and honor to be able to discuss these important issues with everyone this morning. And we are so fortunate to be joined by 3 corporate leaders who are working to improve diversity in their respective companies and their industries. They are, as you can see, Stephanie Lajoie-Lubin, the Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Program Manager at CarGurus, the largest online automotive marketplace with more than 900 employees across the US, UK, and Canada. Guy Pacitti, the global leader of inclusion and diversity for Pegasystems, the software company that operates in more than 20 countries with more than 5,000 employees. And KeyAnna Schmiedl is the head of culture and inclusion at Wayfair with a more than 10-year history in the space of organizational development and DEI, with a keen interest in bridging the divide between the two. As Sarah just said, this is not just about us talking to you this morning, it's about including you in the conversation. And we are going to do that right off the bat with a poll question that we would love for you to answer right now. You should see it pop up right there. And our question is, do you think this shift to remote work during the pandemic is helping DEI efforts, hindering those efforts, or both? And if you please select your answer, we will be able to see in real time how you are thinking and what you think your companies and your industries are doing. So again, do you think the shift to remote work, which happened so rapidly and unexpectedly during the pandemic, is helping DEI efforts, hindering them, or both? And now let's start the conversation with our panelists. I didn't answer the poll question myself. I don't know if the panelists did, but we're going to leave that up to the audience because I'm going to ask many, many questions to this wonderful panel this morning. So I want to start with first gauging where we are with this issue. The country has changed. A lot of people have changed, hopefully for the better, and are more aware. But let's go ahead and ask our panelists, what is the state of diversity that you see both in your company and in your industry? I'm going to ask this to all 3 of you, but let's start with Stephanie.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. And thanks for starting with a really phenomenal question. So I would say, in my perspective right now, the way I would describe this moment is a reckoning, right? I believe across the sector, there's a lot of momentum, a lot of commitment, right? But very so progress to change. And I think this moment is a time where leaders are asking themselves, what do we stand for? And who do we want to be in this new world that we're having this opportunity to really recreate and capitalize on, but also to really sort of reckon with what's happened across our country, economically, our systems, our culture. And so when I think about sort of the state of diversity and what's happening, right, there's some key things. There's this drastic shift that's needed around culture change, around understanding systems change, around retention strategies, around our language, right? When we're talking about underrepresented populations and people of color, there's a lot of trauma that may have been happening. There's a lot of work there. There's a lot of intentionality that's needed. So I think we really have to take an in-depth look at ourselves and start to really reckon with what have we done in our systems that's caused this, that's been created, and what do we need to do to really diminish this and move forward and create a more inclusive company, a more inclusive world, and to really improve upon that. And even when we look at the, the big tech companies, the Googles, the Microsofts, right, and we see some of those reports where they all started to really show their diversity reports in 2014, and we're looking 6 years later, there hasn't been a shift, right? So at this moment, it's really an opportunity to say, what are we doing? What can we do better? How do we look at our systems? How do we get uncomfortable? How do we understand change? How do we reckon with language? How do we really, really address this so that we can really shift drastically moving forward? And so I believe that's the moment that we're in right now.
Stephanie, thank you. From online retail, let's get Guy's perspective being in a giant software company.
Yeah, thank you, Janet, and thank you for having me here today and joined by such great colleagues. The way I think about this, I think about diversity and inclusion being inextricably linked. So diversity is something that we mandate. It's the numbers, it's the percentages. And when a company looks at that, it's about hiring, it's about retaining, and it's about advancing. So the advancement part is probably one of the biggest pieces that we struggle with, because the first step into leadership, the first step into management is the most significant step for underrepresented minorities. We're kind of fighting an uphill battle because we're paying the price as an industry for the years of this discrepancy in terms of representation. So the challenge is at an individual level, you can't be it if you can't see it, right? So the visibility of leadership is so important when it comes to representation. From where I sit within Pega, we have experienced such growth, 20% growth per year over the past 5 years. The challenge is really balancing our hiring with velocity. So with that growth, we've had so much need to hire that when you move at velocity, it's increasingly important to manage the diversity and the recruitment process. So that's the diversity piece. The inclusion piece is what we cultivate. It's the feeling of what it feels like to be in a company. And the current state that we're in some ways, as difficult as it is to work with and to live in, it has activated a dialogue. It has made people at all levels more equipped to be able to talk in the workplace about what is happening outside of the workplace. And also that translates into talking about the systems that exist within all of our organizations, whether it's our workplace, our society, et cetera. So one of the things that I think about when I work within the organization that I am is the growth that we've experienced. We've brought on leaders in addition to individual contributors who come from different companies, some of them small companies and some of them large companies. And what I try to do is activate those leaders to share with each other their different perspectives from the past and how they can set the tone in terms of inclusivity in the workplace.
Thanks, Guy. So you mentioned growth several times and the pace of growth at Pega. This is a good transition to KeyAnna because you are part of one of the fastest growing companies in Boston. And even though it's now been around for a few years, it's also considered one of the newer companies in Boston as far as companies of that size. And yet, even the newer companies that we feel may have a better grasp of diversity and better control of it, it's not always the case. So we love your perspective from Wayfair.
Sure, and thank you. I think I would echo everything that has already been said. And what I'll add is this. I think the conversation now, both the one that we are being forced to have along the lines of the reckoning that Stephanie mentioned, as well as just the opportunity for us to reflect on our growth, right? Similar to what Guy mentioned, we were hiring at rapid paces, right? And outpacing some of our own internal systems in a way that really mapped well to when we were a smaller organization, when we were, getting just a little bit bigger, but then all of a sudden you're at the size that you're at. And in this moment, you have to be able to pause and to look around and say, what is working for and against us in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how do we make sure that everybody sees themselves as part of the conversation, part of the discussion, and part of the key driving forces to getting us more to that space of an inclusive culture? To the point that Guy made, I agree that diversity is looking at the numbers, but what I think has been missing all along is that we've been using diversity too often as a euphemism for very specific dimensions of diversity, as opposed to using it as holistically as possible, which would have already allowed us to count folks like, not to call you out, but Guy, who presents as a white male, they should be part of the conversation. Diversity shouldn't default to people of color or, non-male, or to folks who identify in the majority, right? And so I think that this is also an opportunity for us to just baseline that education and get a little bit more specific with our language about who we're talking about, what are our goals, who does that serve, and how do we grow the pie? Because I think the last piece around, we haven't seen much movement even with some of the larger tech firms, is this idea of you might see a shift of 1% representation of, folks of color who are in the engineering space. And that 1%, it seems to move from Microsoft to Amazon. And so what you can imagine is that we're all trading the same talent instead of looking at opportunities to grow the talent pool and the talent base and of investing further upstream. And so I think that this moment also allows more of that flexibility and thinking about, okay, let us take into account all the work that has been done to date and why it's not working, and how do we get creative? And I actually think that's where, in tech, we are good at that. We're good at, disrupting the system and solving for these, previously thought of as insolvable challenges. And so how are we taking that mindset to DEI work? How are we letting it work for us to solve the equity equation that then gets us to that true level of inclusion, so that we can feel like we can stop talking about diversity because we have been talking about it for so long?
So KeyAnna, it really struck me when you said that sometimes we may not be investing enough down the line to grow that new talent base. And I want to follow up the next question with you first. And I think I want to ask everyone the same question. Since this is not a new issue, perhaps it's more prominent now because of recent events, but it's not a new issue. Tech is primed to solve problems. So why haven't the numbers really shifted meaningfully when it comes to DEI? Can you answer that for me, KeyAnna?
Sure. I think really it's not a problem unique to tech, but people tend to think of tech by default as innovative and different from some of the more traditional kind of lines of business or industries that have been around a lot longer. And so I want to be fair to the fact that, when tech came on the scene, I think a lot of people had default thinking about what it would do and how it would work, as opposed to recognizing the systems that support, the educational industry, that support who has access to what, really still feeding into the same pipeline challenges that you would see in the banking systems, that you would see in other industries. And so I think what has happened is that tech realized it and they couldn't get away from talking about it and having the spotlight placed on them as solve this challenge. I think where we have the opportunity to get more creative is thinking beyond our, four walls, or I guess now in this virtual environment, all of the walls that make up the organization, and really thinking to the communities in which we work and serve, to the larger systems that feed into, you know, from middle school to high school to, you know, college and higher education. What is the setup there, and how come we feel like we don't have all of the right access? I think the other piece is, where have we been more traditional in our thinking than we would like to admit? And how is that limiting us from seeing potential talent out there that may be more presented like diamonds in the rough, or just so different from the standard profile that you think about when you default think to tech, that you're not even mindful of the fact that you're saying, oh, but the pipeline isn't there and we have to develop it, right? I also want to be fair to the fact that, yeah, there's some of that, but the talent is out there. Are we just open to folks who are different in so many ways from the default, beyond just what they look like, but also their background, socioeconomic status, and thinking? And I don't know that if we're being honest, I don't know that we have always been there. I think we have all liked to think of ourselves as being there, and it's not lost on me that we're having this conversation as 3 organizations in the Northeast, where people by default are like, oh, but they're liberal, and so they probably think like X. And I think that this has been a moment for us all to reflect the ways in which we've probably inoculated ourselves with some of that as well. And we have the opportunity to really look internally and acknowledge that change starts at home.
Yes, and that whole idea of having the conversation, because we want to place it not only in the time, but where we are. And indeed, people do from around the rest of the country consider New England, especially the hub of Boston, to be more advanced in all things. And I think most people would assume that tech itself is a great equalizer. But Guy, it's not always, right? And I want to shift to you, because Stephanie and KeyAnna work in companies that focus on retail, although they have a lot of people in high tech to run the companies, the focus on retail, while your company is the focus on software, which means you've got to hire a lot of engineers. It's not always a great equalizer, is it?
No, it's not. And there is a balance that we try to strike between people who are in an engineering function and in other functions. We and technology companies broadly struggle more in the engineering area than we do in other functional areas like human resources, et cetera. One of the things that both Stephanie and KeyAnna have mentioned, or the words that I've heard come up, is around the conversation. And I think one of the really difficult parts of activating an inclusive environment is based upon a concept called the common information effect. And essentially, what this common information effect says is that if left to our own devices, we gravitate toward information that people have that is similar to our information base. You know, we go to a party or we go to an event and we're talking to people and we find out that there is some similarity. Let's just say we've both gone to the same college. So you talk about that, but you don't find out information that is unique to that person or those people. So research actually shows us that diverse organizations that don't have an inclusive environment are actually less productive and less innovative than even homogeneous organizations, because you share that broader range of information. The magic happens, the exponential innovation, creativity, and profits, when we have a diverse environment where people have unique information that they're bringing to the table, and they feel like it's a safe environment and they're valued for the individual in addition to being a part of a collective group. So I think that the shift that DEI professionals really need to think about is, how do we create a movement that activates an internal conversation so somebody can pursue information that is not similar to theirs.
So, Guy, let me ask you this, and if you could give me a quick follow-up, please. I have been doing several interviews with companies in Boston that are considered pleasant places, good places, positive places to work. And yet I've had CEOs tell me, we didn't have those conversations because people felt uncomfortable. They had them in their heads, but they didn't have them in actuality. A lot of this really emerged during the interviews we were doing around Juneteenth, and of course over the summer, and then even leading up to equity in voting. So let me just ask you for a quick answer, and then I want to move to Stephanie, is how do you shift from those conversations in your head to having them with the workforce?
Such an important place for us to go today, Janet, because experience shows us that when someone who is in a position of privilege is engaged with an underserved individual, that they refrain from saying anything because they're afraid that they will say something offensive. And this is very unfortunate because silence equals being complicit. So the problem that we need to solve is to equip people to be able to come to a place of vulnerability and just say, I don't know, can you inform me? I'm not really sure how to phrase this, but what's your recommendation? And that's difficult in the workplace because we are so habituated to putting on armor so that we present as strong. So it's really about encouraging vulnerability, encouraging the conversation, and it doesn't happen overnight. And when you try to do that at scale across a large reaching population, it becomes more and more difficult. So what we need to do is really target, first and foremost, the leadership of a company. They are influencers, and then also the informal influencers that have power within the company to activate a broader population. So it's really about changing the mindset that it is okay to be vulnerable in the workplace and to go to places that might not feel comfortable.
And also to understand that when you go there, there might be high emotion because of past events, and to accept it. So there's another challenge too. And Stephanie, I want to ask this question to you. It's not just the discomfort of having these important conversations. It's not just the challenge of becoming vulnerable and sharing and opening up, but also there's something that affects all of us. We find ourselves really busy. So Stephanie, how in also a very intense environment, a company that's going at a fast pace, how do you create opportunities for people to have these conversations just simply in their busy day?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first I would say you really have to look at the system and the structure. That's always my approach in my work when I think about diversity, equity, inclusion, is what is the system? How is it created? And how does it actually foster or hinder conversations and opportunities? Because I feel like that is the impetus for where we are right now, right? The lack of systems thinking, right? When we even think about, the points that Guy and KeyAnna mentioned around recruitment, hiring, retention, how do we think about social capital? How do we think about networking? How do we think about recruiting in those same networks, this homogeneous culture, right? How do we force ourselves to get really uncomfortable to create inclusive spaces where we're really targeted and specific about the change that we want to see and about our goals, right? I've done a ton of consulting work in the past, and a lot of times companies are like, I want to create a more inclusive culture. I want to increase diversity. Okay, for who and for what? What is diversity? What are you talking about? Are you looking at sales? Are you looking at engineering? Are you talking about your LGBTQ plus population? Are you talking about Black and or Latinx individuals, right? When we're taking an equity approach, we really have to look at who are all the players that are part of our system and what do they need exactly to thrive, to be successful, to feel comfortable, and to feel that they are part of this culture. And I think that approach and that thinking is really, really expansive. It takes a lot of intentionality. It takes a lot of thoughtfulness, right? It's not as easy as going through a strategy, right? There's a lot of ups and downs, but I think that is how we get to a result where we're actually able to foster belonging and really create places where people can truly bring their authentic selves to work and truly thrive. It's how do we look at the system that we've created? How do we break that down? And how do we tailor equity across the board for multiple groups and populations who are across our structure? And then I think also in terms of thinking about those conversations around inclusion and equity in the workplace, I think right now we have some really amazing opportunities. I feel like even in this remote setting, there's a lot of opportunities for flexibility, for remote work, to rethink benefits, to rethink culture, to rethink how we connect, right? And so although the year has been challenging, I think how do we capitalize on this to really recreate what we want for the future and what inclusion and equity can look like, and how do we design for those different populations?
Stephanie, since you brought up a point that we're all struggling with, like how to connect, I just want to briefly ask our audience to connect with us now. Be part of this conversation. You can use the chat function in this GoToWebinar and just type us a text. And if I miss it, I will have the other panelists or Sarah call me out. And we're going to try to use as many of your questions as possible. You can weigh in on your thoughts, what you're seeing in your industries, questions. You're also allowed to ask questions of any of the panelists. As we continue now, and just, text anytime. KeyAnna, I'm going to ask you that question because this is something that we are all feeling right now, and it's frustrating. It's even part of, Zoom fatigue and people not sleeping at night. It's because we cannot connect the way we used to. So in your role, as you're working on DEI issues, how are you just helping people connect, not just with that, but in general, so we still feel good and comfortable working with each other in general?
Sure. I think this kind of runs into the busyness, and I think the connect point there is, what do you value in your organization and how do you demonstrate those values, right? So after the events of late May and early June, we came together quite organically and in partnership. I call her my partner in crime, the person who heads up internal communications. We decided to launch the Change Starts at Home series. And what we said was, we are going to have a series of conversations and we're going to go there. We made sure that our CEO was part of that first conversation. And we talked about racial justice. We talked about what is happening, and we brought the outside in, and also had the conversation about, and where does this exist internally for us? Have we thought about that? And what does this look like? In order to kind of co-create the space of both psychological safety, but also pushing the conversation forward, we were very, prescriptive in our structure, where we had folks from our Black ERG, they're called Way Black. We had 4 or 5 folks share their experience, and we said it could be on anything. It could be on something from work, your time at Wayfair, at another job. It could be completely unrelated to work, whatever it is that you feel like you want to bring to this conversation and have people hear. And that period of time, there was no Q&A session for that, right? Because the idea here is we shouldn't question people's experiences. This is an opportunity for us to listen and understand a perspective that may not be close to our own. And then the flip side of that was, we had senior leaders in the organization, and those were the folks who I moderated a panel with. Those were the folks who the audience got to ask questions. And I have to say that in the virtual environment, I think it benefited us in a few different ways. One is, I don't know that everyone would have felt comfortable going there and sharing if they weren't in their own spaces and feeling like, I'm at least surrounded by the stuff that I know and I love in my own home, and I feel safe here. I think the other thing is, there's a little bit of that bravery that comes in with being in a room and standing up and asking your question, whereas when you're virtual, you are imagining yourself as part of a sea of voices. Right. And so we got so many more people involved in the conversation because there wasn't a separation between who was there live in the audience versus who is, on the phone or participating via video. And what I want to do for folks is help them to understand all of the ways in which this virtual environment is actually able to enhance the ways that we have conversations and who we connect with, because we don't have this proximity bias of I constantly talk to the people that are around me and build really good relationships there. But the further to my literal, like, how close do you sit from me periphery, the harder it is for me to identify that person or understand what their story is. And so we've really leaned on our ERGs during this time. They have gotten very creative in making sure that people remain connected in ways that are both fun, but also opportunities for learning. And then I think the other thing that this virtual environment did was it gave us a space to say you can learn at your own pace. Whereas when you're in person, especially when you're delivering trainings and things like that, it's like by the end of this training, everyone should leave with the following, right? But if you have a few folks who are stuck at point 2 and you've still got 2 more points to get to, in this virtual environment, they can stay there and they can, do what they need to figure their way out to progress, or to say, look, I'm stuck. I just need to have a conversation about this. And that helps me to know, am I outpacing where the organization is at? Are there other folks who are stuck here too, and they can be a good collective for each other? And I think it forces me to think in ways that are a little bit more unique than what I would do by default in person, needing to come up with something in that moment. And then the last thing that I'll say is, part of my role is also stewarding the culture and values of the organization. So it's been a really phenomenal time for us to say that DEI is part and parcel to our culture and values, and that it manifests itself in a few different ways, but that we prioritize having these conversations that are uncomfortable, that I demonstrate vulnerability every time I get out there and speak about something, and that we have people at different levels demonstrating different levels of vulnerability, so that folks understand there's not just one way to approach this, to the point that Guy was making of thinking all of these conversations potentially need to look a certain way or follow a certain formula.
Those are such amazing points. I actually have another question that I want to ask all three of you, but KeyAnna, I'm going to continue with you right now. You're all in management positions with the stewardship of these issues. Given that this pandemic is lasting so much longer than any of us could have ever guessed. I mean, initially I thought, wow, we're going to be home for a month, and that's a long time. I never worked a day at home in my life, because broadcasting, you have to go to a studio. You can't just log on to the computer, but now we're logging onto the computer. So KeyAnna, if you could give me a quick answer, if you can share the details, are there certain specific initiatives that you all are crafting that are completely new in order to be able to continue your work in this environment that looks to stay virtual for a long time? And you mentioned, which I agree, this amazing sort of silver lining that we can all be together in the comfort of our homes, which does affect how we communicate.
Yeah, I would say if you would have asked, this year, how far would we get in maturing our DEI strategy, I would not have even come close to the point that we're at right now. I think that this has been a great accelerator. One of the things to your question about initiatives is we took a leap and put out there a conversation guide, a courageous conversation guide to mimic the Change Starts at Home series, to say, if you want to have these discussions on your teams, if you want to just get together with a group of folks that typically you would grab lunch with in the office and have these discussions, here's a way for you to do that. The number of folks that I partnered with in order to build that is both astonishing, and also it's just it reinforces that DEI should not just be owned by one person or seen as one's function, but it should be owned and shared as a responsibility by everyone, right? Because we had folks who went deep on psychological safety who were able to contribute to that guide to make sure that things got set up correctly. We had folks who helped us to tweak the questions so that introverts, we made sure that they felt like they could actively participate even if they weren't showing up in the same way as extroverts. And all of these considerations that comes from a collective of people saying, hey, I have an interest in this, I want to do this. The other piece that we mapped with that was we had built a racial justice hub internally. And we had a lot of folks who were sending us articles, sending us books and saying like, have you read this? Have you seen this? Is it okay for me to share this? And we vetted those. But then along with those, we built toolkits to go along with them so that people had access to resources so that if they said, I want to have this conversation, I don't know where to start or what to talk about, they could map that to a resource and they could kind of choose their level of comfort and where they would like to go. But we also told folks, you're not allowed to not have these conversations. They're no longer taboo in the workplace. They're actually integral for us to make sure that we have a space that centers inclusion and belonging.
So we do have a few questions from the audience, but I don't want to interrupt this flow right now, asking you if there's anything you can share about some of the initiatives you're doing, given the virtual continuation of our work. So if I could just have a short answer first from Guy, if there's anything you can share that's unique, like what KeyAnna was saying, maybe this virtual lunch or a new handbook or something that you're doing.
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind. One is that we've really leaned into creating networks on an instrument that enables people to have a dialogue, WebEx Teams. One of the most successful ones is for working parents and caregivers during this time when they are homeschooling. They've got people around them. They have challenges that are related to this remote working situation. And what that's also done is help to introduce people that may have not worked together before or heard from each other before. So it's really been an instrument to build relationships across the organization as well. The second thing that I wanted to mention, and I know KeyAnna mentioned her conversation guide, which is terrific and inspirational in terms of how the work that she's doing. What we've done is curated a set of 12 TED Talks and instituted a TED Talk of the month, which is launched on a monthly basis, all different topics from from bias itself to particular underserved populations, et cetera. And we've created a discussion guide for each of those TED Talks so that managers are equipped to be able to have the conversations and have questions that they can pose at staff meetings. And it also provides a framework for common language and something for people to talk about where they probably can feel a little more safe than having kind of an unshepherded conversation around bias.
So I want to see these handbooks and I want to see your curated TED Talks. They sound amazing. Stephanie, quickly, anything that you can share with us about some of the new initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so many things, but I really want to focus on this area of psychological safety and wellness, because I feel like that's been a really common thread among all this, particularly in the remote setting and what's happening. And so we've instituted a few things, additional mental health days. And so just really encouraging people to take extra mental health days and opportunities to care for themselves and shutting things down across the board. Really focusing on really targeted wellness sessions. And so we did a mindfulness session where we had some external speakers come in, do yoga, do mindfulness, recorded those sessions so you could sort of join at your leisure when you could during your day, as well as bringing in a lot of external thought speakers to talk about some of these challenges and issues and provide training, experience, and opportunity for folks to really engage. Our ERGs, right, running programming and opportunities around wellness. We started a new parents ERG who recently launched a survey. We're also doing some coaching opportunities and sponsoring different parents to go through sort of a coaching and mindfulness training and workshop of how to sort of coach and be a parent through these tremulous times. And so really this high focus on psychological safety and wellness, in addition to some of those other pieces around even curating different resources and tools. And also recently in the summer, we launched like our DIBS dialogue conversations. And so having these inclusive conversations with our teams, with managers and leaders to really talk about what does inclusion look like, what's happening around the world, but how do I lead and how do I show up for my team and myself? And those have been extremely powerful, and we've run those across the company on almost all of our teams.
Before we get to some questions, I want to share a little bit from my company. It wasn't intentional, but I actually feel that my company is doing a great job. You're talking about look and what things look like and how we see. Something that we do, because my boss loves metrics, is that we actually get a snapshot of who we interview every month, how many women, how many men, who's represented, and we're forced to look at it like, oh boy, we interviewed 30 CEOs, but we only had 5 women. And every time we go to an event, I am asked the question, is it diverse? Who are the other panelists? Who are the other guests? And it's really great. And then also about the training that KeyAnna was saying, or maybe it was Guy, we are able to go through certain training at our leisure. So the other night I did a diversity little training at 1 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. And as I was doing it, I reminded myself, I think we all have to remind ourselves that we are in charged times because we have come to this moment that's awakening, but we're also going a little bit out of our minds. And so I have said to people, I forgive you in advance if you snap my head off, and I hope you forgive me because I just lost it over something that would normally never bother me during a normal time. And I just think that just saying that is really great. But on the other, as you were saying before, it's opened the door for us to do more, which is great. All right, let's get some of the questions from the audience. You've been patient, and I hope you've been as fascinated by this conversation as I have been. I'm going to let Sarah read some of the questions that have come in now.
Yes, so we have 3. I can go ahead and read all 3 of them, and then we can take one at a time if that works, just so we know that there's enough time.
Sure.
Is that okay? Okay. So the first is, do you feel like ERGs are exploiting Black minority groups' feelings? To ask people to share their feelings for free and have them work and develop solutions for free perpetuates the same issue that we are trying to solve. That's the first. Second, how have each of you approached the equity part of the issue, providing different support to different groups? And then the third, vulnerability looks different for everyone, but it seems like majority groups are being asked to be slightly uncomfortable because they don't want to say the wrong thing, as opposed to marginalized folks are being asked to be vulnerable and are potentially being exposed to trauma, loss of job, etc. How do we begin having these conversations knowing that there are different consequences to vulnerability? So some couple of really powerful ones there. So if you want, we can go back to the first one. Do you feel like ERGs are exploiting Black minority groups' feelings? To ask people to share their feelings for free and have them work and develop solutions for free perpetuates the same issue that we are trying to solve.
So,
Okay.
So I would actually like to couple that one with the third one. And what I would say is this: one, when, for example, when we started Change Starts at Home, we put this out as an ask and not a mandate. And before we even asked Way Black, we had a conversation with their co-leads and said, would you be interested in this? Can you help shape this with us? Right? So this was not shaped on our own. The way that I kicked off that Change Starts at Home session, and everyone that has included a marginalized group, which has been every single one of them, is that we shared about privilege, we shared about vulnerability, and we shared the purpose of the stories and the question and answers. And I did frame it as like, this is an opportunity for individuals who have volunteered to share their stories with all of you, in the hopes that this helps you to understand where they're coming from, and that we can all then be better colleagues, right? That the purpose of the question and answers with the leadership was to hold them accountable for the buy-in that's necessary, for the changes that are necessary in order to move the needle, and to be able to put to them where there are, questions about an inequitable or non-inclusive experience, how are we going to address this? Because I don't think that solve should be on our marginalized communities or on our ERGs, but I welcome them to the conversation of suggesting what they would like to see, how they would like to work, how they would like to partner in this. And so to that piece around vulnerability, this is also where I can use my privilege of me being in the role that I'm in to curate a certain conversation and discussion. And also, because I'm comfortable with it, I'm also willing to put myself out there. And so I always make that offer of, and if no one wants to say anything, that is absolutely fine. But also talking with our counterparts. So one of the trainings that I developed, we call it Culture of Inclusion 201, is this idea of intent versus impact. And we've been spending a lot of time over the last several years focused on intent and not enough on the impact. And so I think that in order for there to be change, it typically comes from a spot of I am uncomfortable and I want to change this, but we're not letting that change move us backwards. And so we have been very explicit about that, and making sure that we have support from the leadership in order to ensure that that happens. So I definitely hear you. It's a concern that I have always had around, like, how do we make sure that that this is not exploitative? And some of the ways that we have ensured that is making sure in performance reviews and things like that, folks' time for the ERG is reflected in there. Knowing that they are part of the leadership and they have executive sponsors, these are also the people who are advocating on their behalf, and people know who these co-leads are and the work that they're putting in so that they can be thanked, compensated, acknowledged in the ways that they should be.
Could I jump in very quickly with that? I think that that issue is an important one, because I think people in general should not work for free. And this is not just related to diversity issues, but if you work on any important initiative in your company, I think that it warrants a conversation with your manager saying, let's carve out time, work time for me to do this work, be it a diversity initiative or be it some other project that really in the long term is good for that company. So I think it's almost also related to situations I've seen with women that have not always spoken up because they felt, oh, I should just do this and be the good person in the teamwork. And really, someone told me a long time ago, be paid for your work, be paid for your value. So that's just the peanut gallery MC weighing in. Stephanie.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think, one, echo and uplift everything KeyAnna said. I absolutely agree. And I think share a little bit about my approach here at CarGurus. So our ERGs are maybe under 2 years old. So we're going through a process of restructuring. So adding executive sponsors and having more of that buy-in, being more structured with our co-leads. And to answer that question around exploitation, particularly with our Black ERG, it's definitely something, and with all of our ERGs, that I want to be intentional and aware. So similarly, designing with them, reaching out to them, asking their feedback. You can choose to engage or not. And I think two really great examples is around everything that happened with Juneteenth. Like all of a sudden, companies wanted to celebrate Juneteenth and try to ask ERG leaders to do this. And our ERG leaders said, no, like, I don't feel comfortable. Like, I'm still going through my own thing. And our CEO stepped up and like ran a session with a friend of him on Juneteenth, and it was phenomenal. And I think really demonstrated active listening of like, this sort of group of people right now can't do this, are really going through XYZ. So we need to think a little bit more creatively about how to still be intentional about this and foster education and culture. And he ran with that. And I think that's a way that, right, you can be an advocate, you can be a leader, and you can listen to your ERGs. Similarly to that point, because we're new, I'm currently in the process this quarter of really restructuring what does it look like to compensate, to recognize, and to support ERG leaders, diversity advisory teams, right? Because right now there aren't conversations with managers. It's not a part of their performance review. They're not getting extra compensation or professional development. And so I'm going through this process now to provide that proposal. So looking forward, we're really thinking strategically about how we're uplifting, supporting, compensating, whatever that may look like for our ERG leaders who are driving equity inclusion work at a really high level across our company. And I think that's a newer thing. I don't think a lot of companies are doing that. And so definitely encourage folks who have that type of power and have that seat at that table and executive sponsorship to start thinking about that.
Yep. So important. And I agree, Stephanie and KeyAnna, you both touched on something that I wanted to kind of add to, and that is, I think it's a really delicate balance when we look at underrepresented populations and ask for information from them. It's a delicate balance. If you do nothing with it, it's detrimental. I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are privileged to take that feedback, do something with it. And as Stephanie illustrated with her, her president, to provide visibility to the rest of the organization about what people of privilege are doing with that information, what response comes out of it.
I want to quickly sneak in a question now before we continue with the audience questions, because I think it's important. We're talking about diversity in the general workforce, but I want to ask you about putting and adding diversity to management and leadership roles, because we all know that so much is set at the top. And so we need to aim for that. So can I have a fairly quick answer for you, because we're, believe it or not, running out of time. Some of the things that you're doing to try to groom, train, direct people so that they become managers. How about KeyAnna? We'll start with you and then we'll go to Guy and Stephanie after.
Perfect. So a few different things. One, we earlier this year did set hiring goals because similar to the point that you made, Janet, about Bloomberg sharing the numbers, we now have our diversity dashboards in place where people can see from recruiting and hiring and all the stages there through engagement, performance, and attrition, and a few other markers, what's going on in terms of different dimensions of diversity. And so we found that for us, we tend to have a gap for women and for folks of color at some of those more senior levels. So we wanted to be able to call that out and give a little bit more guidance as to how we'd like to see this play out in our recruiting and hiring structures. Mapping that to also acknowledging who is currently here and what are the programs that we can build up around them to support, and where do we need to acknowledge that those programs need either additional pieces to the equity piece in question 2, or they need to be different altogether, right? So especially right now, the conversation around leadership development, it feels really tough to have that conversation and be a person of color and hear, okay, yeah, that would work if I was white, but the perception of me challenging that really tends to come off as a negative, and then I get this negative feedback, right? So how are we making sure that those development programs speak to the nuances that different dimensions of diversity bring to how you approach certain things that you expect all leaders by default to do? And then where can we explore things like, coaching and mapping that coaching to match dimensions of diversity? Where should sponsorship and advocacy actually be different from dimensions of diversity that you represent, et cetera? So we've, I wouldn't say that we're there yet, but I would say that we are exploring a number and piloting a number of different things and trying to understand, okay, what's our formula to make sure that we're addressing this not just by recruiting and hiring, but also by developing our people.
Guy, do you want to weigh in quickly on that?
Yeah, that's very similar to some of the things that are initiatives that we're looking at. First of all, it sounds like we're in the same cycle of having a dashboard for our leaders to review with a regular cadence to see how their organizations are doing, from the applicant level to the shortlist level to the interview level to the higher level, because there's opportunities along that path for bias to slip in or for the numbers to shake. So that's one of the things that we're doing. The other thing that I wanted to mention is I have worked at other companies, previous companies, where they have tied compensation to of the leadership team to diversity results. It's a relatively controversial discussion. I think a lot of DEI professionals have had this conversation. There are pros and cons, but it is one lever that people can pull to drive accountability at senior levels.
So Guy and Stephanie, I'm going to have you answer the next question, but we have a bunch of questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to ask Sarah to read a bunch of them, and I can't believe the time has flown by so fast. I'm going to have Sarah read some questions, and then Stephanie, you jump in first with whatever you want to answer, and then the rest of you, let's get as many thoughts out there in our final minutes. Sarah.
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure we answered that second one that I had asked before. So how have each of you approached the equity part of the issue, providing different supports to different groups? Then DEI is, and you have answered this one a little bit, but DEI is so big, where to start? Our company is 1,800 plus employees in 30 plus different countries. I have been asked to only focus on US African American population to start in the first year, to not boil the ocean. Do you think this is the right approach? We got a really nice thank you from somebody, and with a follow-up is with, if companies were to do one thing, what would you advise organizations to do to advance their inclusion efforts? And then just one other comment was to add to that at the board level as well as leadership when you are talking about your executives. And then some more thank yous.
So Stephanie, maybe we'll ask you, we're really down to the last 3 minutes, so maybe ask you about where people can start in companies.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I feel like there's a lot of entry points, but I think one is really thinking about, and I can just, speak from my experience, right? It's like, who are sort of the internal champions and the advocates, right? So that we can start to come together and have these conversations and figure out what the approach is. It's a long road, right? And, you can set goals and set those parameters and you can keep checking them off, but we'll sort of keep going through this momentum. So I think identifying who some of those internal champions are, really taking a look, right? If you don't have a culture survey, if you don't have an engagement survey, thinking about sort of what resources and tools you can execute on that, just so that you can start to understand a little bit about what's happening across the company. I think in the same vein of that, from my experience, not harping too much on that data and not harping too much only on the qualitative, but really think about how do we get this balance of quantitative and what is that experience and what are we seeing with the numbers that we don't see represented as well. And I think once you kind of start with those two things, you're able to really understand sort of where is the best place to start. Are we looking at career? Is there a challenge particularly around women? Is it bias? What is the piece of our system, right? And then starting there and building up. Because I think we try to focus on too many things because there's so many things to focus on. But I think if we start with one or two things and really be intentional and thoughtful about that system change and that impact, then we can continue to build right from there.
So I think I'll ask Guy. I think we only have time for this question, that really interesting question. If you had to focus or start with one thing, what would you do?
Yeah, I would respond that I think it's about a methodology and it's a mindset. To think about the work that we do as creating a movement, not as a portfolio of tactics. To create that movement, you need, as Stephanie mentioned, influencers, and you need leadership on board. And think about how we work in a hub and spoke model to create the movement that will pull people along.
All right, and KeyAnna.
Sure. So I would say all of that. I think it's balancing quantitative and qualitative. I think for us, what we've developed is leadership accountability and buy-in, education awareness, and organizing initiatives are the three kind of pillars that we keep coming back to and we build our roadmap around for this DEI work. And then the last thing that I will say is, once you balance that qualitative and that quantitative, it's how are you sharing that out with people in a way that is digestible. So as Guy mentioned, like the breakdown of all of the steps from recruiting through hiring, right? What we then did was build toolkits that map the research on best and promising practices to our current process, and then highlighted where there are gaps between that research and our current process so that folks then knew what are the steps that you could take and organize that by dimension of diversity, right? So I think it's really taking all of the information that's already out there and organizing it for people so that it's easier for you to hold them accountable because they have access to understanding what our processes are and how they should approach this work.
So sadly, we have run out of time, but I want to give you this option to our audience. If you like, you can still email in or chat in questions, and we're going to ask the panelists if they would be willing to answer them. later after the webinar, and Sarah will mail out those answers to all of you. And I also want to remind you that the conversation is going to continue, because this is kicking off a 3-part series of talking about these issues. And I want to tell you that I have found this hour so interesting, and I can't believe how fast it has flown by. And I want to thank so much Stephanie of CarGurus, Guy from Pegasystems, and KeyAnna from Wayfair, and of course the companies that have supported this today. It's been amazing, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for the close. Thank you so much.
And very, very big thank you to you, Janet, for leading this conversation, and just want to echo big thank you to Stephanie, Guy, KeyAnna, to our sponsors, Wayfair and Mimecast, for the series, and our underwriters, Akamai and PTC. And reiterate, please send me, Sarah, at masstlc.org, any questions that didn't get answered. I will take a look at the ones that are being added right now. And to just address, if there was one thing that you could start with, our next week's session is actually going to focus on the one thing that was eye-opening, whether it was the impetus to start something or it was what was executed. And this is going to continue, as Janet said. So thank you very much. Enjoy this beautiful day, and I hope to see you all next week. Have a great day. Bye-bye.